So, we've got a pretty hefty stack of research here about Mary Queen of Scots, and I gotta say, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and she's one of those figures in history where everybody's kind of got an opinion, victim of circumstance. Or did she bring it all on herself? I mean, and I have to say, I'm kind of leaning towards it's complicated the more I look at this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think everybody knows the basic outlines. Queen as a baby, the dramatic marriages, the
Yeah.
tragic ending. But the real story, I think, what's in this research is so much richer than that.
Yeah, and just to start off, everybody knows she became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old,
Mhm.
practically a queen in diapers. But what I found fascinating was how England at the time, Henry VIII, saw this as an opportunity, and they started what they called the Rough Wooing. And it was essentially this campaign of military pressure and intimidation to force a marriage between Mary and the future Edward VI of England.
It's amazing, right? How often these royal weddings were just totally about political power.
Yeah.
And in Mary's case, it actually led to her being sent to France when she was just 5 years old for her own safety. I mean, talk about a childhood upheaval.
I know, it makes you wonder what that must have been like for her. While other kids are out, playing games, she's learning French court etiquette and horseback riding and even becoming an accomplished musician playing the lute.
And that's not just some fun fact. You see, I think back in those days, a queen's accomplishments, they weren't just hobbies, they were tools.
Hmm.
You know, her musical talent was apparently pretty impressive, and she probably used it strategically to charm diplomats, to forge alliances.
Wow. So even her lute playing was part of the political game. I mean, that's fascinating. It really gives you a sense of how different her childhood was. But then at 15, she's married off to Francis II, the King of France.
Yeah, another strategic move, to solidify that alliance between Scotland and France. And it seems like it was a genuine love match, at least according to a lot of the historical accounts.
Right.
But their happiness was pretty short-lived. Francis died young. He left Mary a widow at just 18, and she was thrust back into the Scottish political scene.
Which, by all accounts, was a completely different beast than the French court she'd grown accustomed to.
Absolutely.
And that's when she meets Lord Darnley, right? He becomes her second husband.
Ah, Darnley.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is where your research gets really juicy because some of the sources, they paint him as this handsome charmer,
Mm-hmm.
but others suggest he was much more interested in power, than love.
Yeah.
Some even speculate that he saw marrying Mary as his ticket to basically usurp the Scottish throne for himself.
Mm.
And talk about a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, not exactly happily ever after for Mary. And then their marriage only lasts a couple of years before Darnley is murdered. And that's where things get really suspicious around Mary.
It does. And, it's not just idle gossip because within 3 months of Darnley's death, Mary marries the Earl of Bothwell, who was, shall we say, a person of interest in the whole murder investigation?
Yeah, that's putting it lightly. I mean,
Even back then, that raised more than a
Yeah.
few eyebrows.
yeah, I can imagine. I mean, marrying the prime suspect in your previous husband's murder, that's straight out of a soap opera.
It's true.
It's like we need a scorecard to keep up with all these husbands. Let me see. Francis II, King of France, died young. Then Lord Darnley, her cousin, murdered in 1567. And finally, the Earl of Bothwell, suspected of Darnley's murder. Did I get all that right?
You got it. And all of this, is happening against the backdrop of a Scotland that's deeply divided religiously.
Right, the whole Catholic versus Protestant struggle was really reaching a fever pitch at that time.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
Mary, as a Catholic queen, found herself in a really precarious position.
Yeah, because you have to remember, this is a time when religious convictions, they weren't just personal beliefs. They were very much intertwined with political power. And Mary, as the figurehead of Catholicism in Scotland, she became a target for this growing Protestant faction.
And that's where John Knox comes in, right? He was this really powerful Protestant leader who was incredibly outspoken in his criticisms of Mary.
Oh, yeah. John Knox was a force to be reckoned with. Your research has some really vivid descriptions of his sermons.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a packed church. Everyone's on edge, and Knox is just thundering, about Mary's ungodly rule. He was a master of rhetoric, and he wasn't afraid to use it to challenge her authority.
Yeah, it's amazing how a single person like that, a powerful speaker, can have such a huge impact on the course of history.
It really is.
Yeah.
And in Scotland at that time, religion was the ultimate battleground.
Yeah.
People were punished sometimes brutally for their beliefs. I mean, the tension was palpable.
And Mary, right in the middle of it all. So her marriage to Bothwell, the murder scandal, and this intense religious conflict, it's a pretty combustible situation. No wonder her hold on power started to crumble.
It's like one of those domino effects.
Mm.
Each event just triggered the next, ultimately leading to Mary's imprisonment and forced abdication.
And her son James becomes king in her place. I mean, what a dramatic turn of
It was
events.
imagine being stripped of your power, separated from your son, imprisoned in your own country.
Yeah.
What must have been going through her mind at that point?
Well, one thing's for sure, she wasn't going down without a fight because she manages to escape
Hmm.
and she makes this really desperate attempt to reclaim her throne, but it fails. And that's when she flees to England, hoping for refuge with her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I.
Decision that would ultimately seal her fate. Because Elizabeth, even though she was a relative, saw Mary as a threat, with her claim to the English throne, a rival she couldn't trust.
And that's how Mary ends up imprisoned in England for 19 years. I mean, it's
Mm.
almost hard to imagine that length of time.
It's a long time to be away from everything you know, especially for a queen who once held so much power. And you can see how this period of captivity, it just captures the imagination. Think about it. A queen, once at the very pinnacle of power, now reduced to a prisoner at the mercy of her rivals. It's Shakespearean.
It really is. It's almost like a whole other story within the larger story of Mary Queen of Scots. And speaking of stories, the next chapter involves what might be the most controversial event in Mary's life, the Babington Plot.
Ah, yes. The alleged conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the English throne, and at the heart of it all are these casket letters, this collection of correspondence that supposedly implicated Mary in the plot. But were they authentic or were they cleverly forged to frame her?
And that's where things get really murky because these letters, if they were genuine, were the smoking gun that sealed Mary's fate. But there's been this debate for centuries about their authenticity.
Exactly. The letters were presented as this proof of Mary's treasonous intentions, but there's always been this suspicion that they might have been manipulated or even fabricated entirely just to get rid of Mary once and for all.
So were they the real deal, or was someone playing a very dangerous game of political chess using Mary as the pawn? It's a question that historians are still grappling with today, and that's just part one of Mary's story. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have, but it's a good reminder, I think, that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people and the choices they made and the ripple effects of those choices. And Mary's story, even just this first part, is packed with all of that.
You're right. It's a great reminder that the past is full of these stories just waiting to be discovered. And speaking of discoveries, we're about to unpack even more of Mary's story in part two.
Yeah.
Okay, so we covered a lot of ground in part one of our deep dive into Mary, Queen of Scots. We talked about her early life, those whirlwind marriages, and the religious turmoil that was going on in Scotland. But I guess the question is, where does all this leave us? Was she truly a victim of circumstance? Or were there choices that she made that led to her downfall?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to really understand it, I think we have to kind of go beyond the surface and dig into some of the nuances that your research uncovered.
I like that, digging into the nuances. So let's start with the victim argument.
Yeah.
I mean, becoming queen at 6 days old, that's not exactly a typical childhood. And then being sent away to France, caught in the middle of this power struggle between England and Scotland, it's hard not to feel at least a little bit of sympathy for her, right?
Absolutely. I mean, she was thrust into this world of power and responsibility that most of us can't even fathom. And then you add in, the complexities of the Scottish court, the clan rivalries, the religious tensions. It was a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And she was right in the middle of it.
And then there are the marriages. I mean, it's easy to kind of just paint them as these scandalous headlines, but each one was kind of a turning point in her life.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I mean, the first marriage to Francis II of France, it was a political alliance, yes.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's some genuine affection there. And when he died, it wasn't just a personal loss for Mary. It was a political setback that forced her to return to a Scotland that was really on the brink of chaos.
Then comes Darnley, a marriage that seemed doomed from the start. He was ambitious, maybe even power-hungry, and their relationship was tumultuous, to say the least.
Yeah, and his murder, whether or not Mary was directly involved, it cast this long shadow over her reign. It created this whole atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue that she never really escaped.
And then, of course, there's the marriage to Bothwell, which, let's face it, was a PR nightmare, even if she genuinely loved him. Marrying the prime suspect in your previous husband's murder. Not a smart move, politically speaking.
No, it's almost impossible to separate Mary's personal life from her political life. I mean, every decision, every relationship had these huge repercussions. And that's one thing your research highlights really well, this interconnectedness of it all.
Okay, so we've kind of laid out the case for Mary as a victim of circumstance. But what about the other side of the coin? What evidence is there that suggests that she played a more active role in her own downfall?
Well, one thing is there's the argument that her upbringing in the French court might have actually worked against her. Think about it. She spent her formative years in this world of absolute monarchy where the queen's word was law.
So she may have had a harder time adapting to the realities of ruling Scotland, where the nobility had a lot of power and where compromise was essential.
Exactly. And some historians argue that this might have led her to make decisions that were, shall we say, less than strategic.
Like the marriage to Bothwell?
Precisely. It alienated a lot of her supporters, and it gave her enemies all the ammunition they needed to challenge her rule. It was a political miscalculation of epic proportions.
And then there's the whole question of her involvement in Darnley's murder. While there's no definitive proof, the circumstances are certainly suspicious.
Yeah, and the casket letters, even if we can't definitively prove their authenticity, they add another layer of intrigue to the whole affair. Whether she orchestrated the murder or simply benefited from it, the stain of that suspicion remained.
And let's not forget her claim to the English throne that was a constant source of tension between her and Elizabeth.
Oh, absolutely. Elizabeth saw Mary as a threat, a potential rival who could rally Catholic support and challenge her rule. It was a power struggle that Mary ultimately couldn't win.
It's interesting, one of the sources you provided suggested that if Mary had been raised in Scotland, exposed to the complexities of her homeland from an early age, that she might have actually been a more effective ruler.
Now, that's a fascinating thought. Would a deeper understanding of Scottish politics and culture have enabled her to navigate those treacherous waters more successfully? It's something to ponder, isn't it?
It really is. It makes you think about the whole role of fate versus free will. The impact of our upbringing on the choices we make. But even in the midst of all this drama, Mary still managed to achieve something pretty remarkable. Her son James eventually becomes King James I of England, uniting the Scottish and English crowns.
It's a twist of fate that's almost poetic. She never achieved her own ambition of ruling England, but through her son, her legacy lived on it, shaped the future of both nations.
It's amazing how history can unfold like that, full of surprises and unexpected turns. So after kind of examining both sides of the argument, I guess the question is, where do we land on this whole victim versus villain debate?
Well, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? There's no easy answer. Mary's story is this complex tapestry of external forces and personal choices.
It's like one of those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on how you look at it. Both perspectives are valid, and I think both contribute to a richer understanding of who Mary Queen of Scots really was.
Okay, so as we're wrapping up our deep dive into Mary Queen of Scots, I keep coming back to this idea of legacy. Here's a woman who lost her throne. She spent years in prison. She was ultimately executed. But centuries later, we're still talking about her. Why is that? What is it about Mary's story that continues to fascinate us?
I think it's because her story, it kind of transcends the specifics of 16th century politics. It taps into these universal themes, ambition and betrayal and love and loss. And I think it forces us to kind of confront these big questions about the nature of power, the role of fate and the choices that we make when we're facing these extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the previous parts, we explored that whole victim or villain debate, but maybe that's too simplistic. Maybe it's not about choosing sides, but it's about recognizing the complexity of her story.
Right. It's about seeing her as a human being, flawed, brilliant, caught in the crosshairs of history. And that's where her enduring legacy lies. I think, she challenges us to look beyond the easy answers, to grapple with the ambiguities of the past, and to see history not as a series of black and white judgments, but is this tapestry of human experience.
And what a tapestry it is. And even in defeat, she achieved a kind of victory, didn't she? Her son James eventually became King of England, uniting the Scottish and English crown. It's like the ultimate irony. She never wore the English crown herself, but her bloodline sat on the throne.
It's a reminder that history rarely follows a straight line.
Yeah.
It's full of twists and turns, unexpected consequences, the echoes of the past rippling through the future, and Mary's story embodies that beautifully.
It also makes you wonder, if things could have been different. We talked earlier about how her upbringing in the French court might have hindered her ability to rule Scotland effectively. But what if she had been raised in Scotland, immersed in its culture and politics? Could she have avoided some of the pitfalls that ultimately led to her downfall?
That's a question that lingers. Isn't it? Would a deeper understanding of her homeland have given her the tools that she needed to navigate those treacherous political waters? It's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is, and it speaks to this enduring power of her story. We're left kind of pondering these what ifs and debating her choices and trying to make sense of this life that was both extraordinary and tragically cut short.
It's a testament to the power of her story. She remains an enigma, a historical puzzle that we keep trying to piece together. And it seems like each generation finds new meaning in her story.
Yeah.
They draw parallels to their own time and they reinterpret her actions through the lens of their own values.
It's almost as if her story is this mirror reflecting back at us, forcing us to examine our own assumptions about power and gender and the forces that shape our lives. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of Mary Queen of Scots. She challenges us to think critically, to question the narratives that we've been given, and to embrace the complexity of the past.
Well said. And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? This ongoing conversation, this dialogue between the past and the present. And Mary Queen of Scots will undoubtedly remain a vital part of that conversation for centuries to come.
Absolutely. Her story reminds us that history is not just this collection of dates and names, but it's a tapestry that's woven from the lives of real people who loved and lost and triumphed and failed. And sometimes those lives continue to speak to us across the centuries, urging us to look closer, to listen more deeply, and to never stop questioning the stories that we tell ourselves about the past.
Yeah, so to all of our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into this endlessly fascinating world of history. Because the past is never truly past.
Yeah.
It lives on in the stories we tell, the questions we ask, and the lessons that we learn. And who knows, maybe you'll uncover some hidden gems, some new perspective, or a forgotten voice that changes the way you see the world.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, happy exploring.